see something about the new God argument?
I see your slideshow, including the Chrome or whatever.
All right, that'll work. So the topic of our discussion, as was advertised, will be the new God argument. And just to kind of start out, I'll introduce a little bit about myself too, but I'm going to do it in a way that kind of gives you a sense of how the new God argument came into being, because it came into being in a way that kind of matches my faith journey. Like Connie, I'm LDS Mormon. I was born into a Mormon family. This is a picture of me that you're looking at right there, in my Garden of Eden. And my father was a computer programmer. My mom was a converted Catholic, and so my father, he pretty much taught me my entire childhood that technology and science were perfectly compatible with religion, particularly with Mormonism. So I grew up just thinking that. It made sense to me because my dad told me so. And my mom, one of the things she most loved about Catholicism and that Mormonism also gave to her was an emphasis on the idea that faith without works is dead. Works matter. Practical religion matters. And so she kind of drove that into my head growing up too. And as it turns out, both of those things ended up being a big deal to me later on in the development of the new God argument. I was a skeptical child. I very analytically oriented, loved to ask questions, and started doubting a lot of things about my religion as a teenager. Then as a young adult, my father died. This is a picture of his gravestone that you're looking at. And that kind of brought to head years of skepticism and launched me into a period of atheism. And really for, very predictable reasons, right? Not anything you haven't heard before, problem of evil type stuff, things like that. But of course, in my life, it was a big deal, like it is in most people's lives when they lose their faith. And during that time, there were a few influences that came into my life that made a big difference and actually started contributing to what would become the new God argument. One of them was the works of philosopher William James. You're looking at a picture of him. And William James was a pragmatist. And I started reading pragmatism very seriously and giving it a lot of thought. And it started to really influence my patterns of thought at this point in my life. Another thing that I discovered during this point in time was the writings of a guy named Ray Kurzweil. And if most of you on the call are transhumanists, if you're not a transhumanist, maybe you haven't heard of Ray Kurzweil. But basically, Ray Kurzweil, he's a well-known inventor, but he also became well-known for the way he engaged in his inventions. And the way he engaged in his inventions was trying to predict the future of technology. And he became pretty good at it and is well-known for that. He would trend technology into the future and made some predictions that have been pretty accurate in some cases, kind of surprisingly accurate in some cases. And some of his predictions are quite momentous. They give people pause, and they should give people pause when they hear about them. And the biggest one is, of course, the idea of a technological singularity, the idea that technology will continue to change at an accelerating pace, and that we're headed towards a period of time when technology will change so quickly that ordinary humans would be incapable of understanding the change or controlling the change or really participating in the change in any meaningful way. But of course, he also is an advocate of another idea, which most people here know about, which is the idea of transhumanism. And it's the idea that, hey, while technology is changing, maybe we should be using that technology to change ourselves. And a lot of these ideas really resonated with me during this period of time when I had lost my faith. You know, I had been raised with the idea that that technology was a good thing. I was raised with the idea that we should do something with the technology we have to make a better world. Pragmatism had influenced me. It gave me this idea that, hey, maybe we should be most concerned about the practical consequences of our beliefs and not so concerned about the, you know, the abstract theories of whether something's true, but maybe something's true because of what it can do for us, because of the way it can make our future better. And transhumanism pops into my life through Ray Kurzweil and through other sources. And I realize, you know what, I have a lot in common with these people. These people want to see an abundant future, a thriving future for humanity, where we become more intelligent, more healthy. Maybe we can even banish aging altogether. There might even be ways to resuscitate the dead and bring them back to life. And these sorts of ideas resonated really strongly with my Mormon background. I thought, well, you know, this is interesting from a Mormon background and from many Christian backgrounds, probably almost all of them. These are the kinds of things that we kind of aspire to as ultimately what heaven is, right? This idea that we'll live in a place when poverty is gone and aging is gone. We become immortal and we become, the dead are resurrected and the world is turned into a paradise. And so when transhumanism came into my life and started telling me these ways that we might be able to pursue these similar visions through technological means, through practical means, that resonated with me too. You know, this whole idea, faith without works is dead. Well, I hoped for this wonderful future. I lost my faith in it because of various reasons. But then transhumanism comes along and says, hey, maybe you should still believe in those ideas. Maybe modified, but maybe you should believe in something approximating them. And that inspired me a lot. And so that brings us to what is the first assumption of the new God argument. And that first assumption of the new God argument is essentially transhumanism. It's this idea that humanity will not become extinct before evolving into superhumanity. It's a pretty big idea, but also in a sense, a simple idea. It's simple in the sense that, hey, we're just going to assume for the sake of this argument that transhumanists are right. Now, maybe we're not right. And then the rest of what we're going to talk about today doesn't follow necessarily. But if transhumanists are right, that's what we're going to be talking about. A few words that we'll be using, that I'll be using, just keep everybody on the same page. When I'm talking about humanity, and when the argument talks about humanity, we'll be talking about it from a biological perspective. Humanity is organisms of the Homo sapiens species. There are other legitimate definitions of humanity, I know, but those aren't the ones I'll be referring to in the case of the argument. Intelligence, in the case of the argument, is the capacity to achieve goals. This definition of intelligence pretty much comes from artificial intelligence research. It's kind of a generic, you know, it can apply to humans, it can apply to non-human animals, it can apply to computers. The capacity to achieve goals across different situations. Even a flush toilet has a little bit of intelligence per this definition. Superintelligence, then building on the previous definition, superintelligence is just intelligence that's greater than that of its evolutionary ancestors in every way. Posthumanity is the evolutionary descendants of humanity. And so combine superintelligence and posthumanity together, and what do you get? You get superhumanity. And so that would be an evolutionary descendant of humanity that is greater in intelligence in every way than humanity is. And we're just talking about humanity from a biological perspective, a species perspective. So any thoughts or questions on this so far? This is the first assumption of the new God argument. You basically have to, either you are a transhumanist already, or you kind of have to assume that you could be maybe a transhumanist. And that's where the argument begins, with this secular notion of transhumanism. Thoughts or questions?
Yeah, I have a question. And maybe you went over this, so sorry if you did, but it said faith assumptions. So are we using the term faith, meaning we're having faith that these things will come to be? This isn't a supernatural type of faith, or did you already explain that? I might have missed it.
No, you didn't miss it. That's a great question. Let me give that a little bit of an explanation for you. Yeah, so I'm not referencing faith in any supernatural sense, but also not in a sense that is antagonistic to supernaturalism. I'm just using faith here in the sense that faith is an active trust in a possibility.
Okay.
It's so, in the book of James in the Bible, James says, faith without works is dead, as I've referenced a few times. And then he goes on to give some really practical examples. He says, hey, if you see somebody who's naked or somebody who's hungry, it's not enough to just say, hey, be fed, be clothed. You actually have to help them. You actually have to give them clothing and give them food. And that's your faith. That's an expression of faith, that you do something practical in line with your hope that they can be fed and clothed. And so the faith assumption then is this idea that humanity will not become extinct before evolving into superhumanity. The idea is to trust in that proposition in an active sense. And we'll see where the argument leads us if we trust in that proposition in an active sense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. That was a great question. I should have explained that. Any other questions at this point?
Yeah, I had a question. In this faith assumption chart, how would you define consciousness, especially when you get to the superhumanity level?
Yeah, I would say that consciousness is different than intelligence, and that an intelligence can be conscious, might not be, doesn't matter in some cases. Personally, I look at the fact of being conscious or consciousness as kind of interchangeable with the word mind or the word spirit. For me, they all mean the same thing. And I also, this is totally tangential to the argument, not at all necessary for it, but maybe interesting. I also happen to be something of a panpsychist, by which I mean there's maybe something of a proto-spirit or a proto-mind or proto-consciousness everywhere. That mind and matter are pervasive, so to speak. And so in that case, even the flesh toilet, may have some kind of proto-consciousness built into it.
That's for just kind of for historical notes. That's also like the viewpoint of people like Teilhard de Chardin, right? So the omega point and the noosphere and so forth. His understanding of those comes out of that kind of a view of things.
Yeah. Yeah. So does that help, Omar? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but that kind of leads me to my second question. Then, would you posit the existence of a soul, and how would that fit into your sense of post-humanity and superhumanity?
Yeah. So the word soul is an interesting word. In my Christian tradition, in Mormonism, we use the word soul to refer to the combination of the body and the mind, or the body and the spirit. The whole thing is the soul. I know that it's used differently. For example, I think in Catholicism, only humans have souls, right? And they're using the word soul more like maybe a Mormon would use the word spirit or mind or consciousness, perhaps. I guess what I would say is that this assumption and the entire argument is kind of orthogonal to the theology of souls. It's perfectly compatible with it if you want souls to be involved, and if you want to look at souls in particular ways. There isn't any strong requirement for any particular interpretation of mind or spirit or soul to take the argument seriously and to follow it to its conclusion. It is talking about intelligence, though, so maybe we should mention a difference between intelligence and soul. Intelligence would be something like the embodiment, the particular embodiment that accompanies the spirit or the mind or the soul. So we might, a dead person may have a spirit or a mind that is not as embodied as what you and I enjoy, maybe less robustly embodied, and so would be less intelligent per this definition of intelligence, because it has less capacity to achieve goals across diverse situations. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Okay, great. So if we take this faith assumption that humanity will not become extinct before evolving into superhumanity, that raises an interesting question, and that will help us reason through some of the implications of that faith. Because there are some very important implications. I think that there's strong implications of transhumanism that most secular transhumanists do not fully realize. And in a lot of ways, the New God argument is an argument that transhumanists should all have faith in God, but we'll get there later. So this first question, what are the risks of superhumanity? I just want to throw that out there to you guys to start out with. What risks do we face if we trust in this possibility that humanity can evolve into superhumanity?
I'd say the biggest risk would be, if superhumanity is simply our present humanity magnified without the increased sort of moral or empathetic capacities, if it's just an amplification of technical skill, then that could be a disaster. I think of the comic book series that has turned into an Amazon Prime show called The Boys about superhumanity in terms of superpowers. And these are, without any spoilers, it's a universe full of superpowered beings that have, very average ethical centers, which means that a lot of them are frankly criminally minded and or celebrity minded in a way that has them act in criminal or narcissistic ways. And it's a disaster for the planet to have these superhumans running around at this low level of moral development. So, when we think of things we might consider to be volatile applications of technology already, such as nuclear weaponry or the ability of drones to assassinate people by remote control, if you keep magnifying that more and more, that could be pretty undesirable.
Amen. Yeah, increasing technological power, increasing intelligence does not imply goodness inherently.
Yeah, I would agree with Mike that there would be a amplification of the haves and have-nots, kind of like an Animal Farm scenario on steroids, that you have people who have access to the technology, kind of like you do now. If you have money, you have access to better health care, you have access to better food, better housing. And if that's not made available to everyone, then you end up having a 2 or even 3-tier society.
Yeah. There's risks of direct oppression, and then there's the risks of just kind of like consuming all the resources in an elitist way and leaving people to suffer and die and starve, and huge risks in both directions of both active and passive oppression. Here's some additional proposals that kind of take those concerns to their limit, I would suggest. This one's from Elon Musk. He says, I think we should be very careful about artificial intelligence. And I'd add, this applies to superhuman intelligence as well, whether it's artificial or superhuman. We're talking about massively increased intelligence. If I were to guess at what our biggest existential threat is, it's probably that, according to Elon Musk. Bill Gates, he thinks so too. I am in the camp that is concerned about superintelligence. Why? Well, probably for the reasons that Mike and Omar were just pointing out, and other similar reasons. Stephen Hawking. I mean, look at his list of really smart, powerful guys who think this stuff. I think the development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. And there's this guy, a well-known atheist. We have to admit that we're probably in the process of building some sort of God. Now, now would be a good time to make sure it's a God we can live with. Clearly, the implication being, hey, we might not be building such good things. So I want to introduce you to some, this is a little bit technical. This is some theory from artificial intelligence researchers. This one most recently has been developed by Nick Bostrom. He works at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University. He's a philosopher there. And he calls this the orthogonality hypothesis. And the orthogonality hypothesis is the observation that you cannot predict the final goals of an intelligence based on its complexity. So let me say that again. You cannot predict the final goals. You can't say that they're good goals or they're bad goals or what those goals might be. You cannot predict them based simply looking at the complexity or the superhumanity of an intelligence. So that's basically what we were saying a few minutes ago, right? Mike was saying, hey, listen, just because we can make better tech doesn't mean we're going to use it well. That is that idea. This is the orthogonality hypothesis. They're not correlated, according to Nick Bostrom. Now, I actually think he's a little bit wrong, and I'm going to tell you why in a second. But this is an important idea. It's important to recognize that very intelligent persons or very intelligent beings or very intelligent machines can have very evil or very stupid or very self-destructive goals. You can't predict one based on the other. But you can a little bit. And Bostrom admits this to some extent, but I don't think he's admitted it quite well enough. And here's, I call this the semi-orthogonality hypothesis. That's my name for this extension of his hypothesis. And it's the recognition that an intelligence can only have goals that are as complex as its anatomy. It's impossible for an amoeba to have a goal as complex as you and I. It doesn't have an anatomy that's sufficient to conceive of and maintain such a goal. And so that actually, excuse me, knocks out quite a bit of possibility space. But even knocking out that huge possibility space, that simple intelligences cannot have complex goals, it still doesn't help us very much with superintelligence. Because as superintelligence comes along, it is intelligent enough to have just about any, well, it is by definition intelligent enough to have any goal that you and I can imagine. Plus a whole bunch of other ones that we don't have the anatomical capacity to imagine. So that's the semi-orthogonality hypothesis. What are the consequences of the semi-orthogonality hypothesis? Well, as it turns out, there's one more thing that we can say. Not only does their anatomy limit them, but their resources also limit them. And this is called the convergence hypothesis. This also comes from artificial intelligence research. And this hypothesis says that no matter what the final goals are of an intelligence, and remember, we cannot predict those. Those are orthogonal. We can't. We still can predict instrumental goals of intelligences because we know that no matter what your final goals are, you need resources to accomplish them. And so here we are on this planet made of carbon, and this is where the fun gray goo notion comes from. And imagine we make a super intelligent paperclip manufacturer, and what's it going to do with all of that carbon that the world is made out of, that our biosphere is made out of? Well, per the silly story, it will convert all of that carbon into paperclips, and what happens to us? It won't mean to hurt us, but we happen to be made of carbon too, so we'll become paperclips. So the convergence hypothesis is the recognition that despite the orthogonality hypothesis, despite the fact that we cannot predict final goals, and that final goals are going to be very diverse for superintelligence, instrumental goals can be quite predictable often. And those instrumental goals pull us together around resources. No matter how intelligent we are, no matter how stupid we are, no matter whether we're human or non-human intelligences or machine intelligences, we converge instrumentally in our goals. This is really important. One of two things will happen when we converge on our goals. If there are large disparities in our power, in other words, if there is a centralization of power somewhere apart from me, well, then whatever has centralized power that's much larger than my own can use that power to take from me whatever it wants. It might not, remember, it does have a choice, but nothing is stopping it from taking what it wants from me. Centralized power increases the odds of conquest and of oppression, and really no predictable reason why they would need to cooperate with me. Conversely, where there's decentralized power, where the various intelligences in the environment approximate each other in power, it compels them to cooperate. Remember, this is the convergence hypothesis. They all need, no matter what their final goals are, they all need the same resources to achieve those goals, or the same time and space to achieve those goals. Convergence forces them together. They're not powerful enough to just take each other over, so they're compelled to cooperate. And this greatly increases their predictability per the convergence hypothesis. If they can't just kick each other out, they have to come together and cooperate to get the resources that they all need. They have to communicate with each other. They have to deal with each other. They have to make exchanges. They have to make promises. They have to work, whatever it takes. And so as it turns out, decentralized power makes intelligences much more predictable, which is a good thing. They're much more trustworthy. And now imagine the limits of decentralized power. Imagine that power is decentralized to the limit, as far as you can decentralize it, that we're giving power to everybody. What happens? Well, when power is decentralized to its limits, the need for cooperation also gets decentralized and pressed to its limits. And the limits of cooperation, I would contend, are practically indistinguishable from compassion. That's another key point. So we have unpredictable final goals, but very predictable convergent goals, instrumental goals. And then if we manage to decentralize power, then we're forced to cooperate to achieve our instrumental goals. And the more we decentralize, the more likely we are all to become compassionate, at least practically. Whether we feel compassion, that's not what this argument's saying. It's saying practically it's indistinguishable from compassion at its limits. So we actually have.
I have a question.
Shoot.
Yeah, this is Carl Youngblood, for those who haven't met me yet.
Hey, Carl.
President of the Mormon Transhumanist Association. Hi, thanks for this presentation. So one thing I wanted to ask you is that I know in previous iterations of your new God argument, the mention of centralization versus decentralization didn't really have as much prominence. I don't recall hearing it as much in some of your earlier iterations of this. And I'm wondering if you can help me understand how you think it strengthens the argument a little more than what you've explained previously.
Because it more directly leverages the language of the orthogonality and convergence hypotheses and their ramifications. So it's better supported by existing philosophical work.
Okay. I still need to digest that a little further, but I appreciate the answer.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, so let me summarize that a little bit more, maybe to help connect the dots, because this is a little bit technical, and when you're first exposed to these ideas, they're not straightforward, intuitive. So again, you want to live in a predictable world. in a trustworthy world. In fact, you cannot live in an unpredictable world. It would kill you. If you don't know what happens when you put one foot in front of the other, then you will fall down and hurt yourself or die or disappear. And so we need to live in a predictable world. But as it turns out, as intelligences become increasingly intelligent, increasingly powerful, they become increasingly unpredictable unless we require them to cooperate, and then they remain predictable. The only way to make advanced intelligences predictable is to force them to cooperate. And the only way you can force advanced intelligences to cooperate is to not let them become far more powerful than the other intelligences in their environments. In other words, you need to decentralize power. If you keep power centralized, they might be nice, but they might not. You cannot predict their final goals. And when they converge, they're not required to cooperate with you. They can just trash you if they want to and take whatever they need.
Would it be fair to say that human governance is already a form of what you're talking about, where we try to keep one another in check and not give too much power to a single individual?
Yes, absolutely. This has already begun. And that's actually a great segue into the next set of ideas here. We have already been decentralizing power for a long, long time. And we're seeing good results from it, results that would be implied by these hypotheses I'm telling you about. So here's an example: worldwide income from 1800 to present. It's been increasing very quickly, especially in recent years. Worldwide longevity from 1800 to present. Longevity is another form of intelligence and power, and it's decentralizing. More and more people have it. Homicide rates are decreasing. People are cooperating more because they have to. As our world becomes more complex and power becomes more decentralized, we cooperate more. We stop killing each other as much. Steven Pinker has done a lot of work on this concept. He observes that the decline of violence is a fractal phenomenon visible at the scale of millennia, centuries, decades, and years. And tying that back to artificial intelligence research, that makes a lot of sense. As humans become more intelligent through our technology, through our science, it's required of us to cooperate more, because otherwise we kill each other, we destroy each other. And so we're actually seeing that play out, as Carl suggested, at a communal level already. And that leads to the next part, to the articulation of the next part of the new God argument. So the new God argument, as you recall, we already mentioned the first assumption. The first assumption was called the faith assumption, and that is the idea that we will not go extinct before evolving into superhumanity. So now we get a couple more assumptions. The first one here, number one, is basically a summary of the possibility space that's described by the orthogonality and convergence hypotheses. That's what you're seeing there. It's a summary of that possibility space. And so it says, one of these three things must be true. Either we're going to go extinct. That's one possibility. We just could go extinct. That's a real possibility. Or number two, we will not have more decentralized power in the future when we become superhumanity. Or we will be more compassionate when we become superhumanity. Now, you're following the reasoning there? This is the possibility space. These are the things that can happen per the convergence and orthogonality hypotheses. We can go extinct, or we can centralize power. But if we centralize power, what's going to happen? We're going to be either destroying ourselves, which is number one, or we're not going to be as trustworthy. It's far less likely that we'll be cooperative and compassionate if we centralize power, right? So that's the second possibility space, is we won't decentralize. We'll keep it all centralized. Therefore, we won't be compassionate, or probably, remember, these are probabilities. We won't be more compassionate, or we'll go extinct. Or the other possibility is, hey, we actually do survive and we actually do decentralize power. And what's the natural consequence of that? At its limits, we become more compassionate because cooperation at its limits is indistinguishable from compassion. So that's the next assumption. The next assumption is that basically that the convergence and orthogonality hypotheses are true, that they describe this possibility space. And then we're going to make one more assumption. And this is just an assumption. It could be wrong. We're going to assume, for the sake of the new God argument, that humanity will succeed at continuing to decentralize, and therefore superhumanity will be more decentralized than humanity.
Question here. When on part one, when you say or superhumanity probably would not have more decentralized power than humanity has, would it be the same thing there to say or superhumanity probably would not be more benevolent than humanity is?
Yes, that's an alternative statement. That's an implication of that possibility space.
Yeah. So I will say that there's some, by adding the concept of decentralization, this gets harder for me to follow than it was before, but I'm following you, what you're saying now. It's just the leap of going from decentralization to compassion or benevolence is unintuitive I think for myself. I don't think of those words as synonyms, right?
Most people don't. And I think that that's the importance of helping people understand the orthogonality and convergence hypotheses, because they help people understand the implications of the power of intelligence and the urgency of decentralizing that power. Because the only way that humanity will be predictable in the future is if we continue to decentralize power. And if it's not predictable, then we can't be sure we won't just destroy ourselves or enslave ourselves. If it's predictable, then we all have more of a say in it, and we can be much more confident in the outcome. And that, again, that sort of cooperation driven to its limits, I'm saying, is practically indistinguishable from compassion.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really good, and it's an insightful observation. Just, I guess I would suggest that anything you can do to help bridge those unintuitive synonyms would be helpful. And as you expose this, as you compact it into a single slide, it might help to try to, I don't know, include a legend or some kind of thing about terminology or something.
It's a good idea. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Can I, the one thing about that, specifically about the compassion, I'm not super educated or anything on any of this stuff, but that, to me, that was one of the easier parts to follow, actually. And I think it's because, I don't know about anybody else, but if you have a background in like anarcho-capitalism, which I don't consider myself an anarcho-capitalist, but that seems to be a very common type of leap where you talk about the argument they'd make about having, if businesses have more money, then they can pay their employees better. And at that point, who cares why they're giving their employees more money? It's we can call it compassion, or we can call it charity, or we can call it whatever, but the poor people are getting more money, regardless of why. And so I feel like to me, that made a lot of sense. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So an implication of making these assumptions, you'll notice if you had a class in truth functional logic, it's probably already obvious to you. If you haven't, I'll walk you through it. If these assumptions are true that we've talked about, then number one, you can eliminate two of the possibility spaces based on the other assumptions that we've made, and it gives you a conclusion. So we've already said in the faith assumption that we're just going to assume, for sake of the argument, that we are going to survive to become superhumanity. We're going to assume that for this argument, because that's what transhumanists do, right? We assume that we can become superhumanity. And we have practical reasons for making that assumption, right? Because if you assume you're not going to make it, well, that decreases the chances that you'll do the work required to make it. So it's a practical assumption. So we already assumed that number one in the faith assumption. So that eliminates one of those three possibility spaces. The second, number two here on this compassion argument slide, this idea that we will continue to decentralize power, that eliminates another part of the possibility space. And so only one thing is left. If those other two assumptions are true, then there's only one other possibility. And that is that superhumanity probably would be more compassionate than we are, which is number three. So number three is a deduction from the other assumptions we've already made. And in truth functional logic, just so everybody is on the same page, deductions are necessarily true if their assumptions are true. So there's no logical problems possible here. If you're not familiar with truth functional logic, take my word for it. There's no logical problem to find here. The problems to look at potentially would be whether the assumptions are true or not. That's where you look with criticism. And of course, most transhumanists are going to find these assumptions pretty persuasive. Any questions about the compassion argument? That the compassion argument is basically, you take these three assumptions, the possibility space, the faith assumption, and number two here, and you come to this conclusion number three. Superhumanity probably would be more compassionate than we are.
I have one issue with this. It seems to me like I want to believe your line of reasoning, but doesn't this kind of run into theodicy problems where, you know, if you assume that, you know, superhumanity is more compassionate, so why don't they show themselves?
Oh yes, for sure. There are interesting challenges, interesting theological challenges that arise at the end of the whole New God argument, and that's one of them. That's a big question, and definitely worth exploring.
I take it you don't maybe have any answers for that at the moment.
I can offer some ideas. For example, it really depends on the goal of the world that we live in, whether God would present to us or not. Presenting too clearly to us might overrun some goals for creation, might make them not possible any longer. That's actually my personal inclination. I think that the goal of the world that we live in, the goal of God's creation, is such that making God's existence more plain would ruin and undermine the goal of the creation.
Okay.
I know that doesn't satisfy everybody. It works for me. But again, that kind of thing actually doesn't yet play into the argument. That's kind of a thing that gets teased out in the end. You don't at this point in the argument, you don't need to make any assumptions about God at all. These are all perfectly secular assumptions. We're basically saying, hey, the orthogonality and convergence hypotheses are true. We think that we're going to evolve and become superhumanity. And we think that superhumanity will have more decentralized power than we have now. That's all we're saying so far. We're not saying that God exists. That has not been said. In fact, that's where this is leading to. But we're not assuming that. I'm showing that if you buy into these assumptions, which most transhumanists buy into these assumptions I'm telling you about, then they have implications, logical implications. And so far, the only logical implication we've talked about is that superhumanity, which we're not saying it even will exist in the future at this point. All we're saying is that superhumanity, if we become superhumanity, will probably be more compassionate than we are now. And that any superhumanity that could exist probably would be more compassionate than we are now, based on the other assumptions that we've made.
Hey, I have a question about that. Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to quickly volunteer a couple of thoughts there. You could
hey, actually, Carl, can I interrupt you for just
Sure.
a second? I just want to point out we've got about 10 minutes till the hour. We can keep going for as long as we want, but I just want, in case we need to, different people need to time things in specific ways, just want to raise that awareness. So anyway,
right, and I'm happy to just, you know, in the interest of time, move on. I wasn't going to take long.
Let's discuss the Odyssey more at the end. I'm happy to spend more time at the end. I can spend an hour or two longer for anybody who's interested. Even I don't know that you want to hear me yap with you that long, but if you do, I'm happy to. Let's talk the Odyssey and things like that at the end. All right. So we've talked about the risks of superhumanity. We've talked about an argument that arises from recognizing those risks and responding to those risks. Now let's talk about the opportunities of superhumanity. What are the opportunities of superhumanity? You know, what comes to mind when you think of becoming superhumanity? What do you think you might do if you're part of that, or we might do as superhumanity, or our descendants might do as superhumanity? What are the big, beautiful ideas of superhumanity?
I want to see a solar system wide civilization. That's my aim.
I'd say immortality, freedom from pain.
Love it.
My hope is that we can think and feel together collectively.
Yeah, share emotions maybe.
I would say the elimination of classism and racism.
Yeah, so maybe some of your hopes are related to mitigating some of those risks we've already talked about.
I like how, oh, sorry, somebody else?
No, that was just me, Micah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I like how David Pierce talks about gradients of unimaginable bliss. I used to think that was implausible, but I've become convinced maybe it works. So I like that idea.
Yeah. Joy and thriving beyond our current ability to imagine. How creative do you think we could become? Do you think that colonizing our star system is the limits of superhuman creative potential?
I don't think so. But
what's the limit of superhuman creative potential? What comes to mind?
I think we couldn't really know that, because if we could imagine it, we would be superhuman ourselves. And I just think that's sort of beyond human understanding.
Yeah, I hear you. How far can human imagination take us in creative potential? What, you know, when we imagine superhumanity and we imagine them creating the most amazing thing possible that we could imagine that they might do with their power, what is that?
Artificial universes, maybe.
Love it. There we go. I think we're starting to think in the right spot now to move on. Already, of course, humans are engaging in the creation of virtual reality, and virtual reality at some point in time is almost certainly going to be combined with brain-computer interfaces. We've got Elon Musk making Neuralink, Brian Johnson, who has spoken at an MTA conference in the past. His company is developing Kernel. Imagine having these brain-computer interfaces combined with virtual reality and being able to feel a virtual world, taste it, smell it. Brain emulation, another big idea among transhumanists. Maybe we are going to be able to emulate brains and bodies within which our consciousness or our mind or our soul, things that we were talking about earlier, can still operate like they do on our current biological machine. Maybe we are going to be able to create emulations of them in new substrates, in more robust substrates. That's a big aspiration of many transhumanists. Another one, maybe we will go and we will create whole new worlds. Maybe we'll be able to emulate our own ancestors in an effort to get to know them better, to understand their world, maybe because we love them. Possibilities like that present themselves. And that leads to a well-known argument among transhumanists. And fortunately, this one is more well-known than the convergence hypothesis and the orthogonality hypothesis. This one's called the simulation argument. And the simulation argument comes from this, well, it doesn't actually come from Nick Bostrom, but he's most well known for formalizing it in a publication in Philosophical Quarterly. And Nick Bostrom in Philosophical Quarterly says that he goes through various steps of reasoning to get to this point, but he basically says one of three things must therefore be true based on a chain of reasoning that I'm not going to make time to go into right now. Either we're going to go extinct, he says. This might sound similar to the creation argument we were talking about earlier. We're going to go extinct, he says, or for whatever reason, we will never simulate many, we will never run many ancestor simulations. For whatever reason. That's another possibility in the possibility space. Or the third possibility in the possibility space, if the first two things are not true, of necessity, logically and probabilistically, we're almost certainly living in an ancestor simulation ourselves. And if we had more time, we could get into details about why he makes that argument and why I think it's a very strong argument. And we could go into that later too, if we have more time for those who want to remain. But then he makes this comment, belief that we will one day become posthumans who run ancestor simulations is false unless we are currently living in a simulation. So that's Nick Bostrom's conclusion. And of course, that has had very strong waves throughout the transhumanist community and well beyond. People have heard about this. Here's a fellow who knows about the simulation argument, the wealthiest man in the world these days. If civilization stops advancing, that may be due to some calamitous event. So maybe we should be hopeful this is a simulation. Why is he saying that? Because he knows the simulation argument. Think about what Nick Bostrom said. Either we're going to go extinct, or we won't create many ancestor simulations, or we almost certainly live in an ancestor simulation ourselves. So Elon Musk is recognizing that number two is just ludicrous from a technologist perspective. What, we're never going to run many ancestor simulations? We're already doing that in some ways, very low res, but why won't they get much better? Why won't we be able to connect them with brain-computer interfaces? In his mind, it's obvious that we eventually will. And so that only leaves two possibilities, extinction, or we're living in a simulation. So he says, we better hope we're living in a simulation because going extinct sucks. So that's Elon Musk. This fellow, Richard Dawkins, science fiction authors have even suggested, and I cannot think how to disprove it, that we live in a computer simulation. Who knew that even Richard Dawkins entertains this idea? Well, he's not the only popular atheist who entertains this idea. This fellow, Sam Harris, statistically, therefore, it is more likely that we are simulated ancestors. This guy too, another atheist. I want to get the likelihood that you think we are in a simulation. 10% chance? I think the likelihood may be very high. Neil deGrasse Tyson. So I've got news for all of these fellows. I've got news for Neil and Sam and Richard and Elon, and I also have news for Nick Bostrom, and I've talked to Nick about this, and he agreed with me. You can generalize the simulation argument. You can generalize the simulation hypothesis for any feasible creative mechanism. So the simulation argument is not applicable only to simulated worlds. It's also applicable to terraformed worlds. It's also applicable to cosmoformed worlds, whatever that might be, creating baby universes like this picture. The simulation argument, its logic and its form and its implications are true for any feasible creative creation mechanism. And so I call that the creation argument and the creation hypothesis. And again, as a nice appeal to authority, Nick agreed with me that my reasoning on generalizing it was accurate. And so that gives us some more assumptions for the new God argument. The first one follows a similar format to what you saw in the compassion argument. And it's basically just the simulation argument, number one here, generalized for any feasible creation mechanism. So it says either we'll become extinct or we won't create many worlds. Notice the word create rather than simulate. We won't create many worlds emulating our evolutionary history, or superhumanity probably created our world. That's the possibility space. Any of those things can be true. Then remember, by the faith assumption, we reject one of those things in the possibility space. And then number two here, we're going to assume, for the sake of argument, that going forward, just like Elon Musk thinks we probably will, we're going to create many worlds to emulate our evolutionary history. It seems almost nonsensical from a technologist perspective to think that we won't eventually achieve that, assuming we survive. And then, so what's the implication? Like Elon Musk said, superhumanity probably created our world.
I have one question about this. So it seems to me that you could say this for any, for let's say whoever created our world, right? Then that the same line of reasoning must apply to them, right? And then the same line of reasoning must apply to the, superhumans 2 levels above, for instance.
Yep.
So it seems like you could go on and on with this until you eventually must get to some point where there's like an original creator. So it would seem like that would imply you could have almost a flaw on this. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, lots of people have talked
thought.
about that in context of the simulation argument. People have said, well, maybe there's an infinite regression. Other people say, well, no, it makes no sense to have an infinite regression. There has to be a basement. And other people have said, well, maybe there's some other alternative too. Maybe it's indefinite, which is a weird idea that we could explore later. But yeah, that is a common question that comes up with the simulation argument. This argument is true of any given world. So any given world is unlikely to be the basement world. But that doesn't mean there isn't a basement world either. There could be.
It's worth mentioning that Bostrom mentions this in his original paper and points out that it might be a motivation for members of one world to behave benevolently, thinking that they might be judged by those who are simulating them.
Yeah, think of how this relates to the compassion argument. If something created my world, that something is more powerful than me. And so I should seek to cooperate with it. So the arguments impinge on each other.
Yeah, look, I'd add another thought to that, and that's that it's possible that the whole concept of cause and effect is different external to the simulation or creation that we're in. I think it's probably beyond reasonable doubt to say that there's intelligence external to the universe, because where everything points back to some beginning, we cannot in our 4 dimensions perceive or conceptualize something that is uncreated. So there must, if there's something that's external to our simulation creation, then that uncreated is uncreated in terms of the cause of chain and effect that we understand. So I'd suggest that external to, if you've got multiple dimensions of time, we can't conceptualize that. So the basement, as Lincoln was calling it, must be conceptually entirely different to the 4 dimensions that we live in. And scientists are already suggesting that, maybe there's 11 dimensions. That's what string theory is based on.
Maybe so. And this is perfectly compatible with that possibility.
Yeah.
So if you take the compassion argument and you take the creation argument and you put them together, what do you get? You get what we call the God conclusion. And we haven't yet explained why we call it the God conclusion, but we call it the God conclusion. And maybe it's obvious why. 2 things are true. If you make, this is all based on just 5 assumptions that we've made. We've made only 5 assumptions. We made the faith assumption. We made 2 assumptions for the creation argument and 2 assumptions for the, what did I say? Two for the compassion argument, 2 for the creation argument. So 5 total. And we came up with 2 deductions, 2 conclusions. And now we're observing what they were and putting them together. And that is both superhumanity probably would be more compassionate than we are, and superhumanity probably created our world. So if you make those 5 very secular, very mainstream transhumanist assumptions, you get this conclusion of necessity. The deduction is necessary based on those assumptions. Superhumanity would be more compassionate than we are and created our world. It's called the God conclusion. Here are some proponents of the God conclusion, ironically. Richard Dawkins, there are very probably alien civilizations that are superhuman to the point of being godlike. Very probably, he says. He understands this argument. Michael Shermer, another atheist. I would like to immodestly propose Shermer's last law. Any sufficiently advanced ETI is indistinguishable from God. That's why we call it the God conclusion, maybe. Sam Harris, we may in fact be living in a world in which Jesus will return. Our descendants might engineer specific religious doctrines into their virtual worlds. He doesn't admit that he believes that very often. So does superhumanity qualify as God? That's the final question of all of this, right? And I can't answer that for you, but I can give you lots of reasons to agree with me that it most certainly does. Some of this is Mormon stuff right here, but let's give you some resources where you can go if you're not Mormon. Most of us are not. And find reasons to believe that this notion of what we've talked about does qualify as God. And on the New God Argument website, where you can go, newgodargument.com, if you go to the faith assumption section, there is a list of assumption support. And a bunch of these are links to pages on theosis, the word theosis, which is about humanity becoming like God. And there's a section on the Bible, a section on early Christianity, and a section on Catholicism, and another one on Mormonism. I've collected a bunch of reasons from the Bible why you might consider this super intelligent post-humanity that we can become, why that might qualify as God based on Bible passages. I've given you a bunch of reasons based on early Christian authorities. Lots of examples here, ranging from Justin Martyr in 100 AD all the way to Saint Theognostus in 1300. There's a lot more later on as well, but this collection goes from 100 to 1300 AD. Lots of quotes there. We'll pick one out right here. From Saint Methodius of Olympus, each of the saints, by partaking of Christ, has been born a Christ. Those who were baptized into Christ have been made Christs. Saint Anthony the Great of Thebes, deify the soul. The soul is divine. We are here to be tested and deified. The soul is divinized. We might be made God, says Saint Athanasius. Lots and lots of quotes here from early Christians. And then also Catholics. Catholics also teach theosis, but they call it by a different name. They call it divinization. Even some Catholics aren't aware of the fact that they teach theosis, which I find a little bit strange. But quotes here from Pope John Paul, Pope Benedict, from the Catechism on theosis, this idea that humanity can become God. And so basically, the idea is that the New God argument begins with this assumption that humanity can become superhumanity. It ties that in with arguments that superhumanity will be more compassionate than we are, that superhumanity probably created our world if we think that we will ourselves achieve such creative capacity. And then that leads to this God conclusion, which I would argue does qualify as God per the Christian tradition. So there we are. Questions, comments, more things to discuss. Where do you want to go?
I don't think it follows that it's superhumanity that would have created our world, it would be super something. To assume it's hominid creatures like us, I don't think follows from your argument at all.
All right, so the reason it does follow that it's human is because the simulation argument only works because it's about ancestor simulations.
Oh, that's a good point.
So the simulation argument breaks down and it doesn't, its implications don't follow if we don't recognize that it's talking about beings like us. And Nick Bostrom goes into an explanation in his paper about how there's what he calls a loose indifference principle. So it doesn't have to be exactly us. It doesn't have to be exactly Jonathan and Joseph and Michael and Lincoln. But it has to be something that approximates us, or the argument breaks down. And he calls that, and he talks about how loose of an indifference principle still allows the probabilities to work out. It's an interesting read if you take a look at it.
Wouldn't the most important similarities be like our mental and value characteristics, things like that?
Compassion and creation, for example.
Right.
One thing I wanted to just mention that some folks have talked to me or responded when I talked to them about the new God argument is something that came up earlier, and that's a question of like, well, and also it relates to the question of whether this qualifies as God. Some folks have said, okay, so I'm convinced and persuaded that there may be superhumanity or post-humanity out there, but this is significantly different from the God that I've been taught to worship in my own faith tradition, like a God with whom I could converse and have an individual relationship, communicate intimately with. And so there is that question of like the ways in which this God may be extremely benevolent, but somewhat distant, does that make sense?
It could be, but it's also perfectly compatible with a God that's not distant any more than you experience God to be distant or close right now in your lived experience. The argument does conclude that superhumanity would be more compassionate than we are, but it doesn't say how that compassion must be expressed. And as we talked about earlier on with the question about theodicy, there are potentially, logically, there are goals that the creation of our world could have been part of that are consistent with the idea that a compassionate being would not impose itself too much upon us. And interestingly, I think the most persuasive of such goals is the goal of cultivating more beings like itself, more genuinely creative and compassionate beings, because genuine creativity and genuine compassion both arise most probabilistically in situations of risk and difficulty.
I have a question, if I can. So because I find it all fascinating and everything you're saying makes sense, I think, but it's similar to what was just asked. For me, I guess my question is, why do I really care about this God? Because even if he's super compassionate and super intelligent and knows more than me, ultimately tomorrow I have to get up and go back to work, and I got 2 kids I got to take care of, and why am I putting effort into this God? You know, what ultimately, because the God I grew up with was a God that did truly love me, and I could feel that, and I needed to truly love that God. And then the God I kind of believe in now isn't so much of a mystical God, so much as an inner peace I can find every day by meditating, and therefore just finding a genuine peace every day. So it becomes more of a practical God to me. But this God seems to kind of be like less practical, but also potentially he may not even love me. I mean, he may be more compassionate and he may love his creation just like I love my car, but I ultimately don't care about one spark plug. You know, I can throw it away and replace it if I need to. I ultimately love the whole creation though, and he may love me in his own way, but that doesn't necessarily mean I have no proof that he actually really cares tomorrow if my kid dies or not. And so you kind of see where I'm going with that. What's motivating me to put in time and effort to be interested in this God at all?
Yeah. So here's some things that come to mind. The compassion argument is describing super intelligent compassion ultimately, which is cooperation at its limit, as far as it can go. So logically, that would entail whatever you think and whatever we think. Well, it doesn't entail what we individually think, but whatever actually proves to be the most cooperation possible, the most compassion possible.
Yeah.
This almost begs for something like a what is it? Not the ontological argument. Anyway, there's old traditional God arguments that play around with that idea a little bit.
I think you mean teleological, which talks about the purpose. Is that what you meant? Teleological?
No. That than which nothing greater can be conceived.
Yeah, that's the ontological argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't find those arguments particularly persuasive on their face. I actually find the compassion argument much more persuasive than them. But at the same time,
that's the moral argument in the tradition. Yeah.
Here's where I strongly agree with the concern you raise. Nothing in the new God argument as a logical argument is going to give you a relationship with God. But here's what it did for me. What the new God argument did for me is it freed my mind to go where my heart had been pushing me all along, which I could not do in good conscience prior to the new God argument. I had become an atheist not because I didn't feel that there was anything sublime in the world, but I became an atheist because I had persuaded myself that there was no intellectual integrity in taking those sublime feelings and experiences of God and projecting them into what I had traditionally conceived God to be. The new God argument changed that. The new God argument said it's perfectly reasonable. In fact, it's logically implied, entailed. You can't even be a coherent transhumanist, according to the new God argument, unless you believe that superhumanity would be more compassionate than us and created our world. It would be incoherent. And so I should go there logically. And then because I should go there logically, suddenly my heart is free to say all of those ecstatic experiences that I've had growing up and over the years that I questioned because I felt it was my rational duty to question them. Suddenly I'm free to attribute more to them. And not that I should ever stop using skepticism as a healthy tool. Definitely recommend that. But it gives me more freedom in my possibility space of things to imagine possible and to have faith in.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I throw in a couple of thoughts about that?
Please.
So if we imagine beings that are more loving and compassionate than ourselves, and they're looking at a simulation that we are in, they're able to see all of our emotional states and things we care about. So if someone believes in prayer or a relationship with God, if they believe through like contemplative prayer, like listening to God or feeling God or meditative connection, there's potential there to envisage that that's like a back door in the simulation, like it's you calling out to the simulators, and whether it's one person or a whole team of people, someone sees, oh look, this entity in the simulation's calling out for some love, and then they can pay some attention to us and inspire us share us the plan for what they hope the world becomes, etc. Like, I think there's still, whatever your belief in prayer and connection with God is, there's still the possibility of believing in that in this scenario.
Yes.
So it's also worth pointing out, though, that depending on the creative mechanism, the way we talked earlier about the fact that you could have various methods of creation. Simulation would, of course, facilitate that kind of a description. But if it was cosmoforming or terraforming, then it might just be that our world or our corner of the galaxy or solar system was seeded by another super intelligent civilization that is like greatly distanced from us and perhaps does not necessarily have the means of communication. So there are some permutations of the possibility space that might not necessarily lend themselves to that kind of intimate communication. It sort of depends, right? And sometimes when I'm describing this to others, and I just described the possibility that highly advanced civilizations exist elsewhere in the universe, that's very palatable and easy to explain, and a lot of people don't have any trouble going that far with me. And so that's often where I go as a first step. But then they're like, well, why should I care about the existence of these distant civilizations, right?
Yeah, Fraser, kind of extrapolating from your idea a little bit further, I'm a big fan of the simulation creation mechanism, but I hate calling it simulation because it makes it sound not real. I prefer to call it computation, that we live in a computed world. And one of the reasons I love the computation hypothesis so much is for the reason that you just described, in that according to the computation hypothesis, consistent with, rather, the computation hypothesis, God can be, and personally I trust is, experientially connected with creation. We're talking about a super intelligence here, right? A super intelligence. We're talking about an intelligence that's capable of creating worlds. So why do we even suppose that, we might be tempted to think, oh, it's like some dudes in a lab, in some lab coats, standing in front of a mainframe computer. I don't think we're imagining that right. What seems most feasible, most likely, given the trajectory of technology, is that superhumanity will have gotten to a point where their computation capacity and their anatomy had merged. It's the same thing. And that their thoughts constitute creation. And that we are, as the scriptures say, within, on whom we live and move and have our being. And that the atonement, the notion of atonement or reconciliation, or Jesus being connected with humanity, as Christians often talk about, is not just a nice, warm idea, but a powerfully literal one as well. It's a possibility.
As you were describing that, I was imagining this consciousness or consciousnesses that are feeling all of our reality as it's simulating us. And it reminded me of my time in Eastern religions, where there was this idea that we all share this same greater soul and we're all connected. You just kind of made me feel that again, like this connection with God and us all being connected into this one thing together.
Yeah, I look at it very much that way, and it's compatible with this argument. Other thoughts and questions?
Lincoln, I thought about raising a theological question about this. Because you're positing kind of superhumanity as our creator, for different traditions that may seem like it does not qualify for some of the characteristics of God, right? So there are other ways of defining or thinking about God. What I wonder though is there's long religious traditions of various kinds that posit God, existing in some kind of absolute sense, maybe the base layer of simulation, so to speak, and having the participation of intermediaries in creation, right? So it seems like this scenario would allow for a God at some kind of what we would think of as an absolute remove, nevertheless, like acting through beings who are more conceivably like us, so to speak. I don't know, do you think that works? How does that float within this?
Yes, it's perfectly compatible with that. That would be a more Platonic account of God and of theology, right? Which is common. There are quite a few Platonic Christians where God would be the absolute, but as you know, some people interpret theosis as not humanity becoming God in the absolute sense, but humanity participating in the divine ultimately, right? Mm-hmm. Something along those lines. And yes, this argument is perfectly compatible with that. If you want to think of theosis more in terms of that Platonic sense, great. Knock yourself out. Argument still works great for you.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I want to jump off what Mika said. I'm curious which qualities of God you think are not included or possible in this way of looking at it.
Well, so typically, and I think there are good critiques of this, or at least like common critiques in current Christian theological discussion, but classical theism sees God as timeless, existing outside of time and not changing, things like this, right? So these are typically characteristics that are incompatible with an idea of kind of living in time and progressing and having a past and a future and so forth. Now, I think it's like I said, a lot of people are actually criticizing this within current theological discourse. But I think maybe a better way to understand those characteristics of classical theism is to think about like possible worlds, right? So there's a distinction between kind of contingent aspects of God versus necessary aspects of God, right? So the necessary aspects of God that Lincoln is trying to spell out to some degree here are true across all possible worlds that we want to consider here, whereas there are all kinds of other contingent aspects that are very, well, they're just very contingent, right? So whatever superhuman created a particular world, might have a particular embodiment that's very different from others. But there are going to be certain things like compassion and so forth that are going to be universal characteristics. And so I think classical theism is pointing at those universal characteristics and seeing them as some kind of an absolute that in a sense transcends the contingent expressions of those things. And so when a lot of classical theists talk about God, they are speaking about those absolute characteristics, and they don't want to say that those change in any way. And so I think one way that some people, so the idea of like the Platonic kind of descent from an absolute is one way that people square that. But I think maybe one that's more common in the Christian tradition is to actually say, well, God is kind of trifold in some sense. There is an absolute, kind of ultimate beyond that is these necessary and universal conditions. And then there's a more contingent and embodied expression of God or person of God that engages with us and creates our world and so forth. And maybe there's an even more pervasive presence of God that's actually with us and around us. And so I think like different traditions actually try to square those different kinds of concepts in some different ways, while recognizing that in some sense they are all God or all fit that characterization.
Yeah, and the new God argument is compatible with that. What the new God argument would do in that situation is it would apply to the aspect of God that does become embodied, that does go into the world and become the world and grows up and becomes something that rejoins God in a fuller sense eventually. Basically what Jesus Christ models, right, in Christianity.
Right.
I have a couple questions. Well, one implication and one concern of it. So, you mentioned earlier before that there's a possibility in the simulation argument that there's a basement universe of some kind. How would you respond to the idea that this could be the basement universe that we're living in? And I guess my other question would be, what is the implication? Assume we do live in a simulation. What's the implication for the rest of the universe that we live in? Would it be like, is it totally uninhabited, or would the other beings in there also be humanoid as well?
Yeah, great questions. So on the first one, the question is it possible that we're the basement? It is possible, but it's highly improbable. And that's the point of the simulation argument and its generalization to the creation argument. But this is mostly applicable to the simulation or computation version, right? As you're pointing out.
Yeah.
So if we go on to simulate many worlds, as the logic and probabilities, the math points out, Nick Bostrom formalizes this in his paper, we almost certainly are not in any basement world. That doesn't mean we aren't, but the probabilities are very strongly against it.
Yeah.
And he also kind of goes on to say, but we can't know for sure either. You can never know that you're not created. All you can ever know for sure is that you are created, but that, you might have to discover that at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Your second question was, remind me, I'm sorry.
The second question was, assuming we are in a simulation and basically the world is sort of made for us, would this imply that the rest of the universe is uninhabited? Or if it was inhabited, maybe they were also humanoids like us, basically assuming that they were created as well, and therefore would follow the same sorts of logic as the rest of the argument?
Yeah, it's compatible with both possibilities, and the the creation mechanism that you prefer might kind of lean you in some directions. Like if you prefer like a terraforming creation mechanism, then you might be more inclined to think that these superhumans, these gods that we're talking about, are elsewhere out there in our verse of time and space. If you go more with the computation mechanism, you might be more inclined to think, hey, they're outside of our node of time and space. And then there's also a really interesting one, which is actually technically I think can be combined in really useful, interesting ways with computation, is the cosmoforming creation mechanism. There's a lot of interesting speculation around the idea that black holes might make really excellent supercomputers. And so it may make sense to combine the cosmoforming and computation creation mechanisms into one thing. And that might impinge on our sense of whether there's other intelligences out there. Maybe we would choose to create a computation that is very efficiently tailored for one world, and it just creates visions of outer space to the extent necessary to make them think that they're, that it's a consistent world. But if we go with the full-on cosmoforming creation mechanism and creating computers in black holes, that become baby universes, well, then maybe it could be a universe full of all kinds of life, and maybe it wouldn't be limited to the computational resources of its parent universe so much. There might be a way of making matter flow in from ever deeper universes into these baby universes that we procreate. And they kind of, look at Lee Smolin. He's got a really interesting set of ideas about fecund universes. He thinks that black holes might be the mechanism of inheritance, and I don't think that's right. I think it's far more likely that intelligence is the mechanism of inheritance in cosmic evolution if universes are procreating.
So this could actually double as a resolution for the Fermi paradox, I suppose.
Yep, it can. But a lot depends on how you choose to imagine the creation mechanism.
Right.
One of the most interesting consequences, I think, of the new God argument is that, as we've observed, it's very flexible. But where it's not flexible is in its conclusion that if you're a transhumanist who buys into all of these assumptions, these secular transhumanist assumptions we've talked about, and yet you reject the possibility of anything approximating God, you're probably being very incoherent. You need to rethink your worldview. So those very anti-theist transhumanists, of whom there are many, sadly, I think that the new God argument is actually fatal to their position.
I wanted to bring up that point. To me, and maybe I'm thinking about this wrong, but to me, one of the primary things the new God argument does is it takes possibilities off the table. So the possibilities that are left on the table, in a sense, are pretty broad in terms of what kinds of creators and so forth we may have. But I primarily see it as removing certain kinds of atheistic possibilities. Would you agree with that? Or
yeah, that's the primary function of the new God argument, is to say, hey, listen, if you're going to be a transhumanist, you had better believe that something approximating notions of God is possible. And
so
that
along those
probably
same
created
lines,
our world.
Along those same lines, isn't it also interesting to point out that most of the people you quoted, and maybe this was purposeful, but they're all examples of this incoherence that you describe?
Yes, they are. And in fact, the most entertaining one by far is Sam Harris, who actually wrote a blog article entitled, "Should We Be Mormons in the Matrix?" And it's hilarious, of course, because he discovers the simulation argument and he associates it with Mormonism. And I think he did that because he discovered the simulation argument through the new God argument. I can't verify that. I tried asking him, he never responded. But basically, that's where he recognizes, and he admits, the way he admits it, he says, I finally encountered a God argument that gave me pause. So there you go. Quote from Sam Harris: the strongest of atheists has been made to pause.
So how would you say to somebody who wasn't particularly religious, there's this possibility that, the creator of the universe cares about what we do. So if they don't believe in any particular religion, how should they respond to that possibility, since for whatever reason, he doesn't seem to want to be blatant about what he requires?
Yeah, so I guess my approach with them would be to first convert them to transhumanism. If they're already secular, that's the easiest route. Get them to buy into those 5 assumptions that we've talked about. And once they buy into those 5 assumptions, show them the conclusion. Say, those assumptions imply this. Now let's ask ourselves, are we going to still be transhumanists, or are we going to give up this conclusion? Because you can't be a transhumanist and reject this conclusion. It's incoherent logically. So if we're going to be transhumanists, if we think that future sounds awesome and we want to work toward it, how are we going to make sense of all of these other questions? And so what I think it does is it puts us in a position where we start asking ourselves, okay, I want to live in that kind of world. That is my hope. That's my desire. And in fact, I recognize pragmatically that hoping for that and desiring it is important for making it true, because it will require work from me and from you and from our civilization to achieve. Faith without works is dead, right? And so if I'm going to go in that direction, if I'm going to trust in it, then that puts me in a position where I think, okay, if I'm going to trust that it's true that humanity can survive and get to that beautiful point in the future that we're aspiring to, what are the implications and how am I going to explain it? And then we have to become creative. We have to ask ourselves, what does that entail about theodicy? If transhumanism, if the aspirations of transhumanism are possible, what does that entail? What's the possibility space for a theodicy? And maybe it won't always be exactly what we would like it to be. We still have to be reasonable. We still have to be empirical, but it suggests things. And so one of the things it suggests to me is that, people have sometimes made the argument, well, the reason why God doesn't present to us in an easy way is that it would undermine the purpose of creation. And the new God argument actually lends credibility to that for me. Whereas before, outside the context of the new God argument, that it seems like just throwing out an excuse. But within the context of the new God argument, it becomes a living possibility.
Can you say why you think hiddenness is key? Like, what is the thrust of that?
Yeah, so for the same reasons, but extrapolated to the limit, that you let go of your child when your child is trying to learn how to ride a bike. If you keep holding on to that bike, your child is never going to learn how to ride a bike. And so push that same reasoning to its limits. How do you become like God? How do you participate in Godhood? If God is always doing everything for you, if God is always there, and it's always clear and it's always easy, and you're never afraid and you're never put to a position where you can doubt, will you develop the capacities? No, you won't. You won't learn to ride the bike.
So this is the Irenaean theodicy, right? John Hick kind of categorizes, there's two schools of answers to the problem of evil, one of which is that the Augustinian one is basically like free will is such a important thing that God basically grants it, and refuses to take it back. Right.
I would say that they both apply here, right? Because if we're going to become creative gods, what is genuine creativity? It absolutely requires agency. Otherwise, it's not real creativity. It's just copying.
But I think, I think that's right. But I think what the Irenaean thing brings into it is that idea of like, parent and childhood relationship, right? Like there is it's justified not just because free will is justified in itself, but because there is this greater thing that we are aiming to become, and that is necessary. I think I think the Irenaean theodicy actually requires transhumanism, because I don't think that there's anything sufficiently good that would in our experienced world that would justify the amount of evil we experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. The only justification for our world, the suffering that we experience, the suffering that we observe, that has ever approached satisfying to me, the only explanation that's approached satisfaction for me is the notion of something at its limit, which is, developing, cultivating genuinely compassionate, genuine creative beings. Developing new gods, or developing new persons who participate in godhood. As Paul says in the New Testament, we can become joint heirs with Christ in the glory of God, comma, if so be that we suffer with him. It's qualified. We don't just get to become joint heirs willy-nilly. We become joint heirs if so be that we suffer with him.
Yeah.
So I have a question. This idea comes probably from a non-materialist perspective. So I suppose if many an atheist threw it at you, it would be a little incoherent on its own. But the idea of compassion you have, that the necessary distribution or the necessary decentralization of power is going to coerce compassion. That seems like a very functionalist idea of compassion. Like, you could say, though, that like somebody might have in their mind that they would, not desire to be compassionate, but be compassionate out of necessity, just functional necessity. And that would, at some points, that where they are capable of creating weaker beings, that they could express their will to possible malevolence in that case. How would you respond to a critique like that? Because I understand that, like, after a certain point, functional necessity for compassion in a functionalist, materialist perspective would probably end up being essentially the same thing. As, like, because the idea, not really entirely conscious, consciousness would just be the sort of result of the actual actions. That's a terrible way of articulating it, but I think you.
No, I love it. I love it. I love what you're saying. Keep going.
Well, no, that's. I think you got. I think that was kind of the point. Like.
Yeah.
Well,
so you're right. You're right. The new God argument is not something that leads to some static conclusion. It leads to a state of being toward which we need to remain forever vigilant. We have to be perpetually engaged in the work to decentralize power, to create more gods, or to help more and more beings participate in godhood with us, because it's an imperative, because the possibility of an evil God raising itself above all else that's called God, declaring itself God, quoting Paul from the New Testament, son of perdition, right, is a real risk. It's a real risk in this paradigm. It's a real risk of centralizing power in some being that would raise itself above all others. And then all bets are off, right? Because we can no longer predict that being. It could enslave us. It could enslave its own creations. So I think what you're talking about is not a defeater of the argument at all. It's an implication of the argument, that it's a real risk, and it's a risk against which we should be forever vigilant.
Lincoln, I could also add that the question of, like, and forgive me, I'm getting my hair cut, so there's a buzzer in the background, but
Nice.
the question of whether this is a functional type of compassion or a real compassion might also benefit from, like, a look at our ancient past and the degree to which we, as whatever creatures preceded us, the degree to which they needed to cooperate to survive. I think that if we look at primitive humans, they probably would have a type of compassion that seemed probably less developed than what we see in more recent history. And it might seem not very compassionate to us, but I think it probably is kind of a relative thing that depends on how sophisticated we are as a civilization.
Yeah, and that tracks with trends in human civilization that we observe, right? Trends in increasing longevity, improving education, decreasing homicide rates, decreasing violence overall. Checking out Steven Pinker's work is actually, I think, really fascinating on that. And yes, I think you're right. I think what would function as cooperation and their version of compassion thousands of years ago might seem really rough based on modern standards. So next time you see a secular transhumanist, you can tell them, well, you know that transhumanism implies theism, right? And you'll be right. They'll be mad and they'll tell you you're wrong, but only because they're being incoherent.
Thanks for an interesting discussion, guys. It was really fun.
Thanks, Carl. It's great to see you.
Good luck with your haircut, Carl.
Thanks.
Yeah, Lincoln, I love that. That was awesome.
Thank you. I'm glad you liked it. I hope it's useful. For me, it's been incredibly useful in my life. Like I mentioned earlier, it restored my faith. It brought me back out of atheism and it let me follow my heart. And that's actually the more important part. The logic is tangential to that, but the logic is important because it gave me the freedom to be inspired again.
I'm not entirely sure the logic is tangential, because you made the point earlier about the ontological argument and the idea of the most compassionate conceivable being, like that does sort of meld itself into, like, I mean, compassion. Okay, so the most compassionate conceivable being would be God, right? So then if that's necessary, and how does compassion like interact with humanity? So, I mean, I think there is a sense where we could say that God would have a sense of interest in our welfare, so to speak, just due to compassion.
Yeah, and it opens up our hearts even bigger because, yeah, it gets our minds out of the way. It satisfies our minds. It's not that our minds are out of the way. In fact, like you're pointing out, maybe it just aligns them is maybe a better way of saying it. And when your brain is aligned with your heart, it becomes so much more powerful. That's really the power of Christian transhumanism, right? It is so powerful because it does get your brain and your heart aligned. And it is just so much more. We know that as Christian transhumanists, we've felt that. That's why we identify as we do, right? It's transformed our lives.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because you get that, okay, it's either one way, oh, ignore that noise, but it's either like one way there's God or the other, and it kind of like it's not something you can be like, oh well, there's this probability, this large probability that things are going to suck and life is going to be, or like existence itself is terrible because there's nothing looking out for us or caring.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find it really hope-giving, really hopeful for a positive future.
It's substantiating, right? I mean, we go through our lives having these nice stories and we go, could they be true? Could they be? And then we encounter this set of ideas and we go, oh my gosh, it really could be true.
Yeah.
And the hope is reinforced by that. And that's inspiring.
Yeah.
So one other point to make is that really, in a way, all of this hinges on the faith position, in the sense that, like, if we give up on the prospect of a more positive, more glorious human future, then none of the rest of it becomes possible. It really, one of the things that it reminds me of is Mary Midgley's observation that amongst all the different thinkers in the world, there's a tendency towards either cosmic optimism or cosmic pessimism. and that the universe itself is a kind of blank slate, or sort of doesn't show its cards, right? You really can go in either direction. You can look at the situation that we find ourselves in, you can find tremendous grace and providence, or you can look at the situation that we find ourselves and think that it's cold and heartless and there's just absolutely nothing to help us anywhere, right? And it's really interesting that all of these ramifications come from what our position is as individuals and as communities.
Absolutely. And isn't it wonderful that secular transhumanists are missionaries?
Yeah, it is pretty interesting. What's really fascinating for us, and where I think we're only seeing the beginning of this, but in the Mormon Transhumanist Association, we're seeing an influx of a few secular transhumanists who are becoming religious. And I think more of this might happen in the future.
Yes, just the beginning.
I feel like the way conversion will happen going forward is aesthetic, like an aesthetic response to religious visions, right? Like because there is no, you can have a secular community who has no interest in religious discussion or arguments. And then as soon as some folks find an aesthetic in religion that they are compelled by, then they begin considering the ways in which, it might be incrementally true, or, true to some degree. And I think that's a very different approach than we've seen, but I think we're maybe becoming Christian enough to where that path in is actually what we'll see a lot of, which means that we need to really tune up our aesthetics, right? The kind of religious visions we're actually putting out into the world.
Yeah, agreed. And that really is the value proposition of the Christian Transhumanist Association, right? It is there are plenty of secular transhumanist organizations. We don't need one more. There are plenty of them. They're doing all kinds of great missionary work for the faith assumption. They don't know it, but they are. What we need, and what the Christian Transhumanist Association is that recognition that the aesthetic is important and that nobody else is working on that. That's our job.
Yeah, which I think, personally, requires us to think a lot about history, which I'm sure connects with some of your thoughts and interests. But I think we need to think a lot about our religious history in order to understand and recapture like the best aesthetics that we can, right? And to understand how those aesthetics have worked in the past and how they brought us to here.
That's right. What made them powerful in the first place, and how can that power continue to be powerful in context of the new things we've learned and the new things we can do?
Yeah.
How can they be even more powerful as a consequence of that science and technology?
Right.
They reinforce each other.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because that requires, religious traditions do this, but that's a translation work. To read something from someone in 300 AD and relate to it requires, stepping outside of your comfort zone in a lot of ways. You might read it and be, you might find it really, just aesthetically unappealing because you don't really kind of understand its context or understand what it's doing, right? Like, and so I think part of what religious tradition does is help bring those things forward, so we see how they worked then, how we can understand their context now. But I think we need to do more of that work, to understand kind of what our tradition of aesthetics and optimism and so forth actually is.
Yeah, agreed.
You know, actually, a little tangent here that actually gave me I had an idea a while back, just thinking about this very thing. I was like, okay, so we understand, like, so the old idea of temples and, you know, cathedrals, sort of a place where heaven and earth would connect most closely, right? Where people could go and, like, experience that sensus divinitas a little more. So I was kind of curious because, you know, back then, you know, cathedrals, you know, when they were created were like the pinnacle of their technology. Like, what kind of amazing things could we fashion now that might stand for like a million years? Okay, maybe not that long, I don't know, but maybe. Like in like we could like create entire ecosystems, perhaps, like within a cathedral. Because like there's the thing, like we understand things like ecosystems now, and the idea of like how bacteria, even like the smallest bacteria, can affect the human health and the human experience. Like think of all the things we could do constructing a cathedral with that sort of sense of like the pinnacle ideas that we possess. Like what could we create? Like,
Yeah.
I just think something amazing.
Yeah, those temples and cathedrals were the genesis of the creation argument, of the creation hypothesis.
Well, that is even how one of the readings of Genesis is a temple creation process, and the image of God that is, so in the ancient world, you build a temple and you would put a idol, right, a symbol of the God in it, and in the Genesis account, that's us, right? So we are in the midst of the Genesis temple, performing these works, maintaining and upgrading and extending and building that temple.
And then we engage in religious ritual and ordinances in that temple. And those religious rituals and ordinances become increasingly empowered and become increasingly impinge on the world in which we live. They increasingly modify the world in which we live. And soon those rituals and ordinances, those ceremonies, they transcend their nature as mere ritual, and they become actual creation.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about the connection between liturgy and technology, and thinking about like liturgy and algorithms even, right? And liturgy and infrastructure. I think those are deeply connected ideas ultimately. Particularly if you think about law as infrastructure, law emerges liturgically, right? And so our society is ultimately grows through liturgy.
In the beginning was the Word.
Anyway, I gotta go, guys. This was a great discussion. I loved every minute of it. Take it easy. God bless.
Thanks,
God bless
Timothy.
you. Thanks for coming, Timothy.
Yeah, me too. Thank you, Lincoln, and thank you, Micah.
Good
Yeah,
to
it's
see you,
great
Connie.
to see you.
Yeah.
You still getting your hair cut, Carl? I think he's gone. Thanks for the opportunity, Micah.
Yeah, I'm glad we were able to do it, and I think that's good. I think I'll try to put this recording up at some point so other people can kind of make use of it. So it'll be good to get some discussion. So yeah, thanks a lot.
When you put it up, let me know.
Okay, cool. I guess I'll go ahead and end this for everybody since Carl's already checked out, it looks like. And but yeah, thanks, and see you soon. So
later, Micah.